In this example, we're going to take a vector file that was created in the software, and using those vectors we're going to look at some of the modelling tools to create some of the shapes that you can see here. We'll also look at how we can incorporate the free clip art that comes with this software and bring those into our design. Once we've got our finished design, we'll then move over and look at how we can calculate the toolpath in order for us to cut that out on our CNC machine. So let's just come over to File and we'll close this down. And then we're going to go and open an existing file, and from the shell sign project folder we're going to open the shell sign vector file. We use the open option here to open that up. And so you can see that we have a simple set of vectors created in a previous session of the software. And so this is just going to help us to run through this example a little bit quicker. So let's go over to the 2D view control. We're going to use this option here to tile our windows vertical. That way we can see the 2D view on the left hand side, and when we start to create components from those vectors we'll be able to see those in the 3D view on the right hand side over here. And so to create components, I need to come over to the bottom of the interface and switch over to the Modeling tab. So if I select that, that will now open up the Modeling tab. You can see in the top area here I have a selection of icons that I could use to create and edit 3D shapes. And in the bottom area here we have what's called the component tree, and this is where we can view and organise our components and levels to create a composite model that you can then go ahead and view in the 3D view. Now at the moment we have no components in our component tree, and therefore we can only see the modelling plane and nothing else. By default we have a level here, and if I create components now they will be added to this level, and this level concept is a smart way for me to organise my components, where I can add multiple levels and change the combined modes of those levels and the components within those levels to create the desired composite model. And so the first set of shapes that I'd like to create will form the base shape of my sign, where I'm going to look at applying a profile and an angle to this vector here using the create shape form, and then using these three vectors here we'll look at creating a border using the 2-rail sweep tool. So to help me organise my component tree in advance, I'm just going to rename this level by using the right mouse option. We'll come down here and I'm going to use this option here to rename level. You can see that's now highlighted, and I can just easily type in a new name for this level. So I'm going to call this level the base level, and anything that I create now will be added to that base level. So let's go to this option up here to create shape from vectors. It's the first icon under the modelling tools, and we're going to open that up. And so we're going to start by creating a simple dome. So I'm going to select this outer vector here, and what this form does, it allows me to specify a shape profile and an angle that we can go and assign to that vector that we've got selected. So let's do that by selecting a profile. So I'm going to go with this curved profile here, so we'll make sure that that's selected. And then if we wanted to, we could enter a value here in the angle box, or we could just look at using the slider. And if I just tilt my 3D view there, we can see that we're getting some instant updates of how that shape will look if I alter the angle of that shape. I'm just going to type in a value here. We're going to put in a value of 30 degrees. And we're going to go with a 0 base height in this case. Final height we're going to set to no limit. I'm going to set that to add, so it's going to add to the modelling plane, and we're going to go and call this one dome. And then if I press apply, it will take all of the information that we've put in here, and this is the result that we're getting. Okay, so I'm happy with that, so let's just close that down, just put that in isometric view. We can see that we have a component has now been added to our component tree, and it's got the name that we put in the form when we use the create shape option. You can also see that we have a grayscale here in the 2D view to represent that component, and we now have that 3D shape in our 3D view over here. And so the next shape I'd like to create is going to represent the border for my sign. To do that, I'm going to use a modelling function called the two-rail sweep. So it's just the second icon under the modelling tools. So if I select that, we can see that that form is now open. And this allows us to create a shape that's defined by vector rails and a cross-section. So the first thing that we need to do is select our drive rails. See that we already have one vector already selected from when we created that dome shape. I need to select another one, so I'm going to hold down Shift and select this inner vector here. So I now have two vectors selected, and then I can use this option here to use selection, and that's now changed those vectors into drive rails. We can see that their outer vector is now red and the inner vector is now green. And that's based on the order of my selection. So the first one is always red, second one is always green. You can see that there are also arrows on my drive rails, and on both of those they are both pointing in the same anti-clockwise direction, so that when I apply a cross section it's going to start here and then it's going to be swept around in an anti-clockwise motion. So then we move on to the second area in our form. So this is where we select a cross section or cross sections. In this case I'm only going to work with one cross section in this example, which is this one over here. If I just zoom in using the scroll of my mouse, we can see that I have this vector here, and this represents the shape or profile of my cross section that I'd like to sweep between my two vector rails. So I'm going to select that vector, and I'm just going to undraw all of these options in here. I don't need these on for this example. I also don't want to scale this to an exact height. Combine mode, I'm just going to select the default add option here, and then for the name I'm going to call this component border. Then we can go ahead, press apply. You can see that's created that shape for us there. Then we can close that form down. If I just undraw the dome component for now so that we can only see the border component, and if I just zoom in on that border, we can see that that profile is the same profile of our vector here. So let's just put that in the isometric view. And we'll go into the 2D view and then come over to the 2D view control and then use the zoom to fit option here. And then we can switch on our dome shape, and we can see that these components are added together, and the result of that is shown here in the 3D view. So the two shapes that we've just created have both been created using the vectors and modelling tools within the software. And the next shapes that we're going to create are going to be imported from pieces of clip art that come free with the software. So the next component that we're going to bring into the software is going to be a banner that I want to blend into my base shapes. So to help me, I'm going to go and create a new level ready for this component. So I'm going to hover over the base, the word base here, and if I right mouse click, you can see that's opened up a menu, and I could use the option here to insert a new level. See, that's automatically put in level 1 there, and again I'm going to organise this and rename this level. So I'll right mouse click, use the option to rename the level. We're going to call this level the banner level, and then just click to apply that there. And then one further thing that I'd like to do is change the combine mode of this level. So to do that, again I'm just going to right mouse click here, I'm going to go to the combine mode, and I'm going to set that to merge. So anything that I create within this level is going to be blending in to the composite model that we've got, that we can already see here. So it's going to blend in with the components in that base level here. And so to import a piece of clip art into my session, I'm going to come over to the modelling tools and use this option here to import a component or a 3D model. You can see now that I can browse the hard disk of my PC. I'm currently in my project folder, so I'm going to select the banner11.3d clip file and then press open. We can see now that that has been added to the component tree, and the name of that is the file name. So if I wanted to, I could just right mouse click, rename that, and just call that banner, just to simplify that. And we can see that we have the grayscale here in the 2D view, and we can see in the 3D view that the component overlaps my work area, and I can just see an area of this in the lower left hand corner. and so the size and position of my component will always be dictated by wherever it was saved from in the original file that it was made in, where this was centered around 0, 0. So I'm going to select that, and what we want to do is just first put it into the center of my job. So with that selected, let's go over to Align Selected Objects, and then we're going to come over to Align to Material, both vertically and horizontally. You can see it's been added there to the center here. We can close that down. And we can also see that we have this green silhouette here that represents this banner, and the reason that we're not able to see the actual component here is because at the size of the ribbon that it's currently at now, the height of that is smaller than the dome shape that we've got here. So let's go and change the size of this ribbon. And so we're going to go over to the Set Selected Object Size option, and then here we can specify some values. So I'm going to go with a width of 13, and I'm going to keep Link XY checked so that it scales the height in proportion. So if I press Apply, we can see that's made those changes there, and we can close that down, and now we can see that this ribbon is now coming over our dome shape that we've got here, and that's because we just altered the size of that, and so everything is scale in proportion to its X, Y and Z values. So that's selected, let's just move that as well. So we're going to go over to this option here to move selected objects. And so we need to specify the type of move. In this case I'm going to go with the relative, so we're going to move it relative to its current position, and we're going to move that in the Y direction, and I'm going to put in a value of -1.6, and then if I press Apply you can see that that's been moved down there, and that's now in position to where my text is. So let's just close that down. I'm just going to go and maximize the 3D view. So let's just take a closer look at that model. We can see that there's areas here of the banner that are being obscured by the border component. You can see that just by looking at the overall composite model, and we can see the green shadow areas here. So when you see green within your composite model, it's the software's way of telling you that there's areas of the selected component being obscured by other components within your job. So what we need to do here is look at altering the height of the banner component so that it's sat prominent of the base shapes. So if that component's selected, let's go over to the properties form over here. And here we're actually going to look at reducing the shape height. So I'm going to make the shape height of this to be 0.4, and then I'm also going to look at adding in a base height of 0.15. And if I just press the space bar to enter that in, we can see that's been updated, and now my ribbon is sat prominent and proud of those base shapes. And so I'm happy with that. So we can put that in ISO view, we can close down the properties form, and then we could go over and switch and tile our windows. So now I want to bring in one more piece of clip art that I want to add on top of my overall part here. And so again, I'm going to keep my componentry organised. So I'm going to hover over the banner level, and I'm going to look at inserting a new level by right mouse clicking, use the option to insert a new level, and then we'll right mouse click on that level, rename that level, and we're going to call this level Details. So it's always good to name the levels something that's appropriate to the model. And so now we've got our details level. By default it's adding on top of the current composite model, and that's okay. I need that to add, as I'd like my piece of clip art to sit on top of our dome shape here. Now we looked at importing clip art using the import component or a 3D model option over here. We can also do that by going into the clip art tab. And you can see that I've already installed all of the free clip art that comes with the software, and I've gone into my clip art tab and added all of those folders, and so now I can view all of those easily here in my clip art tab. I'm going to go into the decorative folder, and I'm just going to scroll through, and we can see all of those different pieces of clip art that we've got available there. And I'm going to come down to the bottom, and I'm going to use this one here, the scallop shell, and if I double click that, I'll automatically put that in the center of my part. And then we can go into the modeling tab over here, and we can see that that has been added to the details level here. So now I need to look at sizing that. So let's go over to transform objects. I'm going to set the size of that, put the anchor point in the center. I'm going to go and alter the width, make that 4.8. I'm going to check link XY so that it scales in proportion, and then press apply. We'll close that down, and I'd like to move that up a little. So with that selected, let's go over to move selected objects. We're going to move that relative to its current position, and we're going to move that up 0.9 in Y and press apply, and we can close that down. So if we maximize the 3D view, so I'm happy with that, and if I wanted to, I could come over to the scallop shell component and just simplify the name by right mouse clicking, use the option to rename. I'm just going to call that shell. You can see that that's been updated there. I could come into the 2D view control and look at tiling our windows. So now that I'm happy with the model, we now need to look at preparing this for machining, where we look at calculating the toolpaths. So the first thing that I'd like to do is check the overall Z height of my composite model. To do that, I'm going to come over to this option here to scale the Z height of the model, and the software will look at the height of all of those components and it will tell me the current height here. So that's displayed here, and it's just over 0.8 in this case. Then I have this option here to set in an exact height. I'm just going to move that out of the way a second. And so in here we can look at putting in an exact height, so we could put a new value in here where we could scale that up or down in Z, and this is useful as it could help us to scale a model to fit within different material thicknesses. So the material that I'd like to use is going to be 3/4 inch thick, and so we can see that is too big for that, so I'm just going to look at reducing the height of this model. I'll put that down to about 0.55, press apply. You can see that's been updated, and we can see that I haven't lost any detail, and I'm still happy with the way that that component looks. So I can close that down. So now that it's at the height of 0.55 and we're cutting that in 3/4 inch material, we'll have material to spare. So I'm going to go ahead now and press OK here. So the next thing that we need to do to get this ready for machining is create a vector boundary in order for us to limit the area that we machine inside. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select this vector here. I'm going to hold down Shift and select these two vectors here, and I'm going to look at moving these to a new layer, as I don't need these for the time being, but I don't want to delete them either. So to do that, I'm going to right mouse click. We're going to use the option here to move to layer. You can see that I could use this option here to move to a new layer. I'm just going to go with the default layer name, just call that layer 2. I'm going to make sure that that's invisible and inactive, so I'm not going to check either of these checkboxes here. I'm going to press OK. We can see that they have now disappeared. So if I go to my Layers tab and just switch off layer 1 for the time being, then switch on layer 2, we can see that my vectors have been added to this layer, so I can access those if I wanted to. So let's just switch that off and switch the layer 1 back on again. So these layers are a way for me to organise my 2D data. So let's go into the Modelling tab. And I'm just going to go and hold down Shift and select all of these components so that they're all highlighted here. And then we need to create a vector that represents the outside or the silhouette of my sign. So with all of those selected, we can come over here to use this option to create a vector boundary from the selected components. And so we can see that if I just click in the white space, that has created that vector that represents the silhouette of my sign, and we'll use this for our toolpath boundary. So now that we've altered the size and we've created this vector boundary for us to use for the toolpath, we can now go ahead and switch over to the Toolpaths tab. So to do that, we're going to go into the 2D view control, and we'll use this option here to switch to the Toolpaths tab. So it's just temporarily hidden our design tabs that we've got on the left hand side, and then it's opened up the Toolpaths tab on the right hand side. So the first thing that we need to do is set up the material. Now this is important to do so, as this is where we set up our virtual settings to match how we would physically set that up on our machine. So let's go into the material setup. You can see that's opened up the material setup form, and then we can start to alter some of these settings in here. So we're going to start with the Z0. I'm going to Z0 off the top of my block, so I'm telling the software that we're going to set Z0 off the top, and so I need to make sure that I do that on my machine setup also. We then move on to material thickness. As I said earlier, we are working with 3/4 inch material, so I could just type in the value in this box here. For XY datum position, I'm going to set that to be in the lower left hand corner. We can see that I have a red square showing me that in the 2D view, and I also have my origin arrows in the 3D view, so I can see where we're setting that up. And again, I need to make sure that I set that up on my machine, so that's going to be in the lower left hand corner. We then move on to the model position in material. Remember that we scaled our model down to 0.55, and we can see that model thickness is being displayed here within this section of the form, so we can see that 0.55 there, and so that means we're going to have an extra 0.2 material to play with. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to push our model a little bit down into our material block. I can do that by using the slider here. We can see that the light area represents the model and the dark area represents the rest of the material. Okay, so I'm just going to type in a value here. I'm going to put in a value of 0.05, and that's to put in a little gap above the model so that we can avoid any flat spots if there's any inconsistencies with our material. We then move on and check the rapids and the home positions, and if I'm happy with those, then we could go ahead and start to think about all of the toolpaths. Now if you plan to actually machine the example shown in this tutorial, then it's very important that you calculate all the toolpaths using parameters and settings that are safe and appropriate for your particular machine, the tooling that you have available, and the material that you are using. So once I'm happy with all of these, I could go ahead and press OK. So now we're ready to come over and create our first toolpath. So we've currently got our vector already selected, so with that vector selected, let's come over to the toolpath operations, and we're going to use the 3D roughing toolpath option. This will allow us to hog out the majority of the material using a larger tool before we can come back and then safely use a smaller tool to run a finishing pass on. So the first thing that we need to do is apply a tool. So I'm going to go into the select option here, and that's going to open up my tool database. So here I can view all the tools that I currently have in here. I could look at adding new tools if I wanted to. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and select the tool I'd like to use, that being the 1/4 inch end mill. I could check over some of the settings and parameters, feeds and speeds in here. I'm happy with all of those, so I'm just going to go ahead and press OK. We then move on to the machine limit boundary. In this case, I already have a vector selected, so I'm going to use the selected vector option. So then we move on to the boundary offset. I like to put in an offset of 0.18 inches in this case, so it's just a little bit bigger than the radius of the tool that I'm using, and that's to ensure that the centre of my tool rolls past the vector in order for it to cut down the side of my model. We then move on to the machine allowance. I'm just going to put in a small value of 0.03, and so this is a piece of virtual skin that we're going to leave on the part after we've ran our roughing pass to ensure that the roughing pass doesn't chip at my finished surface. We then move on to the roughing strategy. So in this case I'm going to apply a Z level strategy. We're going to raster X. I'm going to come down here, I'm just going to name my toolpath, so I'm going to call that 3D roughing sign. We'll go ahead and press calculate. And so the software has created the toolpath, and you can see that represented by these blue lines here. And so this is the exact path that the tool will follow on the CNC machine. You'll also notice that the software has automatically opened up the Toolpaths preview form, and in here we could look at choosing a specific material to visualize the virtual block. In this case I'm just going to go ahead with the cherry option, and then we could come down over here and preview the selected toolpath. And so the software is going to take those lines and animate the preview, and this will show us exactly what this would look like on our machine using the settings that we put in the roughen toolpath. And you can see the areas that have been machined away. And so I'm happy with that, so we could go ahead and close that down. Okay, let's just put that back in isometric view, and now we're ready to go and create our 3D finishing toolpath. So with that vector still selected, let's come over and use the 3D finishing toolpath option there. And so we need to select a tool from the tool database. I'm going to use this select option here. I'm going to go with an 1/8 inch ball nose, check some of the settings in there. I'm happy with those, so I'll press OK. We then move on to the machine and limit boundary. In this case again I'm going to use that selected vector that we've got selected here. The boundary offset, I'm just going to put in a small value of 0.08, so remember, make that a little bit bigger than the radius of the tool, and that will be able to come down past the side of the part in order for it to cut this side of our model there. We then move on to the area machine strategy. In this case I'm going to go with the raster option, so that's just going to cut back and forth. And then for the raster angle, I'm actually going to put 90 degrees in here, and that means that then it will cut parallel to the y-axis. At the moment, with that being 0, it's going to cut in the x-axis, and I'd like to cut that parallel to the y-axis, as I feel that we might get a better result for our ribbon here. This is also dependent on the material and the tooling, and on the grain direction as well. So I'm just going to go and put in 90 degrees there, so we're cutting parallel to the y-axis, and then we're going to go into the name, and I'm going to call this 3D finish sign. We'll go ahead and press calculate. It's just going to work that out for us. We can see again that the software has calculated this toolpath, and we can see that whole area of blue here. Again, it's opened up that preview toolpaths form, so let's go ahead and preview that toolpath. We can see that it's cut in parallel to the y-axis there. You can see it's taken a little bit longer because there's a bit more detail to work with here. So if we just maximise the 3D view, we can take a look at that. I'm happy with the amount of detail that that tool has picked up there, and we can see that we've got a nice clean finish. So I'm happy with that, so we'll just close that down and put that back in the isometric view. I'm going to go over to the view option up here, and we'll tile the windows vertically. So now I'd like to look at engraving the text that we've got here. So with that vector selected, we're going to come over and use the VCarve toolpath. I'm going to start by looking at the cutting depths. So for the start depth we're going to put in a value of 0, and in this case it's not actually going to be 0 relative to the material, but further down I'm going to use this option here to project the toolpath onto the 3D model. And in terms of the model itself, then the start depth will be 0, and it will be on the surface here in the part. We then move on to the tool, so I'm going to use the select option to bring up the tool database, and then if we go to the V-bit section, I'm going to use the 90 degree half-inch V-bit that we've got there. I'm going to check some of the settings here. I'm happy to go with those, so I'm going to go ahead and press OK there. We then move down the form, and as I said, we're going to use this option here to project the toolpath onto the 3D model. And so that's going to tell the software to take that toolpath, and instead of cutting it at a specific depth, to actually project it down the z-axis until it hits the 3D model, and then engrave whatever settings that we've got within that tool into the components themselves. So here we're going to go and call this VCarve sign, and then we'll go ahead and press calculate there. We can see the toolpath represented by the blue lines here. And if we go ahead and preview that toolpath, we can maximise the 3D view. We can see here that we have nice clean text, so I'm happy with that. So if we go and put that in isometric view, close that down, go to view, tile our windows vertical, and now we're ready to run our profile toolpath. So to do that, we're going to select this vector here, then we're going to come over to the profile toolpath. So then I'm going to come in and specify a cut depth in here. I'm going to cut all the way through my material block, so we're going to go with 3/4 of an inch in here. Then we can move on and select a tool. The tool I'd like to use is actually selected at the moment, so I'm going to use the edit option here just to check over some of the values and settings in here. If I wanted to, if I felt it was safe to do so, I could change my pass depth to be 1/4 of an inch in this case, and that's just going to apply that to this particular toolpath, and it won't affect the settings within the tool database. So I'm going to go ahead and press OK. You can see now that that's going to cut that in 3 passes. We're going to machine vectors outside of the vector. I'm going to come down, and then for the tabs, I'm just going to assume that I have a suitable hold down, so I'm not going to have any tabs in this case. I'm going to come down here. We're going to call this profile sign. I'm going to go ahead and press calculate. We can see again that it's created the toolpath there, represented by those blue lines. And if I just maximize the 3D view and then preview that toolpath, we can see that's been cut out there. If I wanted to, I could delete the waste material by double clicking on that, and that just removes that for me so that I can get more of a better feel of how that would actually look when we machine that. And so I'm happy with the sign that we've got here. If you wasn't happy with your toolpath preview, then it's always a very good idea to go back into the individual toolpaths and alter those, or alter the design itself until you're happy with the toolpath preview, as this is a very accurate representation of how that will look when you cut that out on your machine. And so at this stage, what I could do is go ahead and save a preview image, which I could then go ahead and send over to my customer for them to approve before I go and cut those files on my CNC machine. So in this case, I'm just going to cancel that. If I get the approval, then I could go ahead and start saving out my toolpaths. So to do that, we just close down the preview toolpaths form. And so then I just go ahead and select the toolpath I'd like to save. So I'd select that, use this option here to save toolpath, and I can see that it's listed below the toolpaths to be saved area here. And so I could go ahead, find the appropriate post-processor for my machine, go ahead and save that toolpath, save it. I can put it onto a thumb drive, and then this is the file that I'd go ahead and take over to my CNC machine to run and cut that out. So let's cancel that. Then we'll go through the others again, make sure it's listed, and then you save that, and you go through the rest of the toolpaths. So let's just close that down. And then we'll just go back into the preview form so we can see how that will look. And so that completes this tutorial, where we started off by opening a file that had vectors that were created in the software previously. We took those vectors and we looked at a few tools that enabled us to create components from those vectors. We then looked at importing clip art that comes with the software into our design. And with the design complete, we looked at calculating the toolpaths to cut that out on our CNC machine. So at this stage, it's a good idea to go ahead and save that file. So let's go to File, Save As. In the Project folder, we're just going to call that Shell Sign Toolpath. Press Save, and then you can access that from your project folder.